Hi, I'm Tom Beebekauser with Wetland Restoration and Training. It's rare that you get to see a wetland that was not built by humans. This is especially true when you consider that most of the natural wetlands across the lower 48 states have been filled and drained. Well, I'm excited to show you how you can inspect a natural wetland to figure out if any maintenance is needed. Let's get started.
Natural wetlands untouched by humans are rare and beautiful. They're like jewels in the landscape. You're fortunate if you can visit a wetland that has not been filled or drained to create agricultural or urban land.
This natural wetland provides outstanding habitat for the four-toed salamander. Even though it's really early in the spring, I'm going to check to see if I can find some four-toed salamander eggs. What they do is they lay their eggs underneath these moss clumps right at the water's edge. So I'm going to peel this moss back and look for a female. And I'm being really gentle about this.
The female will be guarding her eggs.
If it's time to lay them.
Here's a four-toed salamander guarding her eggs. This small wetland was not built by humans. It's located on a mountain in Oregon. The wetland formed when the large tree fell over, creating a shallow depression that fills with water when the water table is high in the spring. As groundwater levels drop during the summer, the shallow water gradually dries. Wetlands like this, which fill with water in the spring and dry during the summer, are known as vernal ponds. This is a natural emergent wetland that receives water from a stream. Willows and ash trees are growing along the edges, while cattails dominate the deeper water towards the center. The wetland formed naturally in a shallow basin that's lined with clay, which holds water and maintains the saturated soil conditions where you find the wetland plants. This is a natural wet meadow wetland. There's a sheet pattern flow of water across the surface of the ground. Sedges and rushes are growing in the sunlight. The wet meadow is surrounded by shrub, scrub, and forested wetland. One of the best clues to determine if a wetland is natural or constructed is the presence of a dam. Dams are generally built to be straight with sides that are steeply sloped. Another clue to a wetland being constructed is the presence of pipes in the dam. This constructed wetland has both an overflow pipe and a drain pipe. Finding a water control structure is a sure sign the wetland that you're looking at is not natural. Natural wetlands often have gradual slopes along their edge. It's easy to tell that this wetland was built by humans. First, there's a constructed dam. Next, you can see overflow pipes in the dam. Look at the steep slopes along the water's edge. The edges of the wetland are straight without points or peninsulas. One often sees pits and mounds and an abundance of fallen trees in a natural forested wetland. Natural forested wetlands contain the pit and mound topography that formed over the years as large trees fell over in the swamp. The numerous hills and hummocks show that this is a natural emergent wetland. Natural wetlands provide habitat to many species of wildlife. I found the Pacific tree frog using a wet meadow wetland in the state of Oregon. I often see wood ducks using natural wetlands. You're likely to see beautiful hooded mergansers using natural wetlands in the forest. This female hooded merganser will nest in hollow trees near wetlands in the forest. Wood frogs breed in vernal pond wetlands. They lay their eggs so early in the spring there can still be ice on the ponds. Moose depend on the aquatic plants in wetlands for their survival. Aquatic plants contain high amounts of sodium and potassium that moose need in their diet. White-tailed deer can also obtain the sodium and potassium they need by eating aquatic plants in wetlands. The sedges growing in wet meadow wetlands are of great importance to elk in the fall and the winter months. People who visit this natural vernal pond wetland near Birmingham, Alabama, may think that it's in pristine condition. This is because they see an uncommon ecosystem of large trees in shallow water. Unfortunately, close inspection shows that someone had at one time dug a ditch to drain the wetland. The ditch had been dug along the base of the hill to drain the wetland. The shallow ditch was dug on a gradual slope, so it almost looked level. There were puddles of water in the ditch. The 185-foot-long ditch emptied into Shades Creek. I found a head cut where the ditch emptied into Shades Creek, which had been channeled and moved. The head cut was moving upstream in the shallow ditch and would eventually destroy the natural wetland. Another concern was that large piles of soil had been placed along the edge of the wetland. The piles of soil had filled in part of the wetland. The piles of soil were from nearby Shades Creek when it was straightened and dredged to make it deeper. Before we examine the threats to natural wetlands, let's examine how these wetlands occur on the landscape. To begin with, wherever you travel on Earth, you'll find that the surface of the ground is sloped. The ground you're standing on may have a steep slope that's easy to see, like where the slope is over 6%. Or the surface of the ground may look flat, like this area where the slope is less than 1%. When you go outside when it's raining, you'll always see that water is flowing downhill. Sometimes the water collects in a small basin that we call a puddle. Or the water may collect in a large basin we call a wetland. This wetland basin contains shallow water. Some wetland basins contain deep water like this one. It's important to recognize that every wetland basin is surrounded by a rim. The rim is the natural dam that maintains water in the wetland basin. Think of the rim of the wetland like the rim of a bowl. When you fill the bowl with water, it will flow over the low edge along the rim. A natural wetland basin is like a huge bowl on sloped ground. Water flows over the low edge when the wetland is full. The place where water flows out of the wetland is called the outlet or the spillway. One should carefully inspect the outlet of a wetland to determine if the wetland is in danger of being destroyed. To do this, you must walk around the wetland to identify where water is flowing out of the wetland. Here's the outlet for a wetland that's in good condition. Water is flowing out of the wetland in a sheet-like pattern and there is no erosion. Here's an outlet for a wetland that is a narrow stream where erosion is taking place. Let's inspect a natural wetland that's located in the Cascade Mountain Range of Oregon in an area where there is no farmland. I could see where black-tailed deer were grazing on the abundant sedges that were growing in this wet meadow wetland. We identified the point where water was flowing downhill out of the wetland and began walking upslope towards the source. As we moved uphill, we observed water flowing in a sheet-like pattern across the surface of the ground. The outlet was functioning as both a stream and a wetland, with the stream not having a bed with banks. The soil in the wide spillway was fully saturated. There were no defined stream channels or head cuts present, and no signs of erosion were observed. This beautiful wetland is found on a mountain ridge in Alabama. The wetland is a natural vernal pond that dries in the summer. The vernal pond is on a high mountain ridge surrounded by sandstone cliffs. Water collects in the wetland because the basin is naturally lined with a thick layer of clay. In some years, the vernal pond dries in early summer because the water is so shallow. The wetland can stay dry throughout the fall and early winter. I carefully inspected the vernal pond with the landowners and noticed they had made a trail that followed the natural rim around the low edge of the wetland. The landowner had sloped and armored with rock the outlet for the wetland so it would be easier to cross with a side-by-side vehicle. We found where a shallow ditch had been dug to drain the wetland. Here, water in the ditch is flowing over the edge of a sandstone cliff. As I walk upstream, you can see the narrow ditch and the rocks that were piled along both sides of it when it was dug. Sedges and rushes are growing along the banks, making the ditch appear like a natural stream. However, this is an artificial stream that cut a notch through the natural rim of the wetland basin. Historically, water would have flowed out of the wetland in a wide, shallow, sheet-like pattern over a gradual slope rather than through a narrow channel. We used a laser level to take elevations and found that the ditch had significantly lowered the water level in the wetland. No matter how much it rained, the wetland would never reach its historic depth or size as long as the ditch remained open. I find ditches like this one that were dug to drain almost every natural wetland that I examine. This is a natural wetland in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. Unfortunately, the outlet for this wetland is in poor condition. This is the natural outlet or overflow for the wetland. This outlet is like a wide ribbon of wetland where there is no erosion. I found a second outlet for the wetland that carried water down a steep hill. This outlet was narrower than the natural outlet. There was a head cut in the path of this narrow outlet from the wetland. The head cut had a 3.5-foot high vertical face and was moving uphill towards the wetland. The head cut would destroy the wetland unless it was controlled. The head cut started years ago when a ditch was dug along the upper edge of the logging road. Here's how a head cut like this one we just looked at can destroy a wetland. The head cut begins when someone digs a ditch downstream of the wetland. The head cut will move upstream towards the wetland. The rapid advance of the head cut may be temporarily slowed by the presence of tree roots. The head cut causes a deepening and a widening of the stream as it moved uphill towards the wetland. Eventually, the head cut will reach the edge or the rim of the wetland. Once the head cut moves to the rim, it will move rapidly through the wetland basin because of the saturated soils and the standing water. Here, the head cut has consumed the wetland. Soon another and deeper head cut begins moving upstream to where the wetland used to be. Here's a simplified set of drawings showing how a head cut can destroy a natural wetland. A road is built across the natural outlet for the wetland. The wetland is located uphill of the road. A culvert is installed to carry water flowing out of the wetland under the road. The ditches that were dug to direct water into the culvert cause a head cut to form in the wetland outlet. The head cut advances uphill towards the wetland and drains the wetland, much like digging a ditch. Most of the length of the wetland outlet or stream has become a narrow and eroding channel. The head cut is now cut through the natural rim of the wetland. The head cut moves rapidly through the saturated soil in the wetland basin. This causes great erosion, with tons of soil being washed downstream. A second head cut begins moving upstream, causing a further deepening and widening of the channel. The wetland is almost consumed by the first head cut. The natural wetland is now destroyed by the second head cut. A third head cut is moving up the eroded valley, forming even a deeper gully that will become a canyon. Here's a beautiful small natural wetland on the Umpqua National Forest in Oregon. The wetland is supplied with water from an ephemeral stream. The forest surrounding the wetland burned 5 years ago. We could hear water flowing while inspecting the wetland. This always tells us one or more head cuts are present. The sound led us to a large head cut advancing through the rim of the wetland. The head cut we found had a 4-foot-high vertical face. It was hard to find because it was moving in the soil beneath a dense tangle of fallen trees and tree roots that had been killed by the fire. We measured the length and the width of the deep channel that was cut by the head cut, along with the width of the floodplain, to identify how much rock would be needed to control the head cut. Here's the stream inlet to the same wetland. It's in good condition with no signs of erosion. This natural wetland doesn't look like it's been changed by humans. However, I noticed that water was flowing out of the wetland in a narrow stream, when it should have been naturally flowing in a sheet-like pattern over a wide path. Following the narrow stream downhill, I could see high banks on either side. These were piles of soil that were left over when a ditch was dug through the rim of the wetland. The ditch looked deepest where it cut through the natural rim of the wetland. The red arrow points to the entrance of a culvert under the road, which was downstream of the wetland. A ditch had been dug to concentrate and to direct the flow of water out of the wetland into the culvert. This ditch caused a head cut to form that eroded a narrow channel as it moved upstream into the wetland. The cattails may be growing in the wetland because the water depth was reduced by the head cuts that advanced in the outlet when the road was built. Notice how the color of the water in this wetland is chocolate brown? This shows there's a considerable amount of soil that's flowing into the water. That's why it's important to also examine how water enters a wetland for signs of erosion. The red arrow points to an area of shallow water in the wetland. This area is growing cattails because the water is shallow. The water is shallow because of the soil that is entering the wetland from streams that are eroding. Here is where water from a stream is entering the wetland that has turbid water. The water is clear, showing there is little erosion taking place in this stream. The stream has a very wide channel and is flowing across the surface in a sheet-like pattern where there are no head cuts and no erosion. You don't see a narrow channel that is downcutting. This is another stream that is entering a wetland and not causing erosion. The water is flowing over the surface in a sheet-like pattern in shallow braided channels over a wide floodplain. The abundance of trees and shrubs that are growing on the slightly higher ground are preventing the head cuts from forming. This stream inlet contains head cuts, and it's actively down-cutting and eroding. Head cuts advancing upstream have caused this stream entering the wetland to become deeply incised, forming a deep, narrow channel. Erosion began after the downstream wetland was excavated in the 1980s to create a deep water pond. Soil eroding from this channel is being carried downstream and is being deposited in the wetland below. This is a large and wide head cut that is upstream of the wetland that has the cloudy water. This head cut would be difficult to control because of its great width. You're looking at a natural wetland that has been filled. Identifying where wetlands have been filled is challenging because a filled wetland no longer looks like a wetland anymore. Here is where a small vernal pond wetland has been filled with slash in a timber harvest unit. The outlet to this natural wetland was filled with soil and wood slash from a logging operation. The puddles of water and the green bulrushes show where the wetland has been filled. A skidder with rubber tires has created deep ruts in this natural wetland. The large rock was also displaced. A logging skid trail was built across the outlet and the rim of this natural wetland. Logs were embedded in the saturated soil that were parallel to the flow of water to make a crossing for heavy equipment. Head cuts are advancing in the soil between the logs and will soon drain the wetland. This shallow ditch was dug to drain a small natural wetland in a timber harvest unit. This deep ditch was dug to channel a small stream that also drained a natural wetland in a timber harvest unit. This is where a fire line was dug by hand in a timber harvest unit. The scraped path has become a ditch that is draining a natural forested wetland. The largest problem I found facing both natural and constructed wetlands is the presence of head cuts and streams that are entering or leaving the wetland. Controlling head cuts that threaten wetlands is not easy, nor is it cheap. The roots of these large trees have only temporarily slowed the advance of head cuts in this ephemeral stream. The shear stresses associated with head cuts are so great that the dense growth of tree roots cannot stop them from advancing. How can we expect a beaver dam analog structure we humans build using sticks and plants to control a head cut when this beaver-built dam has not been able to stop this head cut from advancing into a wetland? This outcrop of bedrock has naturally stopped head cuts from moving up the stream. The only sure way of controlling a head cut is to build an artificial outcrop of bedrock. The good news is that you rarely need to build one as large as this natural bedrock outcrop to stop head cuts from destroying wetlands. I recommend using rocks that are buried in the ground to control head cuts. Installing a buried vertical grade control structure made from rocks is the permanent way of controlling a head cut that threatens to destroy a wetland. Here is the type of vertical grade control structure I recommend using to control a head cut. This structure should be used where the head cut has a vertical face that's greater than 24 inches high and where there is more than one head cut in the drainage downstream of the wetland. The vertical grade control structure is built so that water cannot erode a channel under or around the rocks that are buried in the ground. This structure will not fail if there are other head cuts located downstream. The vertical grade control structure acts like a natural outcrop of bedrock to prevent head cuts from advancing upstream into the wetland. The structure cannot fail because the rocks are buried deep in the ground. Head cuts cannot move under or around the buried vertical grade control structure. The bottom of the channel that is armored with rock will appear and function as a natural riffle in a stream. You may be able to use the slope and armor technique to control a head cut if the vertical face of the head cut is less than 24 inches high and if there are no other head cuts downstream of the one that you're working to control. The slope and armor technique requires less time and rock to build compared to the buried vertical grade control structure. It's important to embed rocks into the ground to prevent erosion when using the slope and armor technique. Remember to use rocks to armor the entire width of the floodplain so that water does not cut a channel around the edge of the rock during a flood. Episode 17 and Episode 18 show highly effective techniques for preventing and controlling head cuts. I hope you have an opportunity to visit a natural wetland soon. If you do, please take time to walk around the wetland to see if there's erosion in the drainage entering or leaving the basin that should be controlled to protect the wetland.
I hope you enjoyed visiting these natural wetlands as much as I did. The next time you're at a natural wetland, please take your time, walk around it, see how water comes in and how water flows out, and see if there's any action that's needed to protect that wetland so it can last for many years into the future. Well, if you like this video, please let us know and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. And I wish you every success restoring wetlands in your community.